everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. Today, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence. We're going to talk about the Revolutionary War, and then the first government of what we call today the United States, called the Articles of Confederation. All right, so bunch of cool stuff to talk about today. So you're going to like this. All right, let me make myself small, put myself up here in the corner. Boop, 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 boop. So we're here in 1776. 1776 is the famous year that the Declaration of Independence gets signed. And for simplicity purposes, as I've been saying throughout this unit, 1776 is when everything hits the fan, when all the fighting starts. In actuality, the fighting had already started before 1776. So what happened, as we talked about in the last lesson, at Lexington and Concord, the colonists opened fire. There's starting to be skirmishes. The British realize this is legit. The Second Continental Congress has come out. They've created a actual military led by George Washington, the only guy that really has any military, high-level military experience. And they are going to try to, meaning the colonies, are going to try to stand up to England and the Redcoats, the most powerful country on earth. All right. A couple of things happened relatively soon after the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. One of the main things is people got to pick a side. So we had mentioned in a previous lesson about 20% of the people would identify as patriots, meaning they think that the colony should be their own independent country. And about 20% called themselves loyalists, believing that they should be, stay part of England and let's not keep creating these problems. That leaves about 60% of the population that's undecided or just doesn't care. Very importantly, there's this guy named Thomas Paine. All right. In early 1776, in January, Thomas Paine is a writer and he is a patriot. He writes a pamphlet. It's not long enough to be considered a book, so it's like a pamphlet, so it's easy to read. And it's called Common Sense. He spells out logically why it makes sense to be your own country. He goes through and methodically goes through the reasonings using complete logic over why it is more beneficial to be your own country than not, on top of, if you decide not to be your own country, what the negative aspects are of being continued to be controlled by Britain, especially in this new world in which all these taxes are coming out and Britain is struggling. So for that reason, he writes this pamphlet called Common Sense to try to convince the American people that the colonists, I'll just start calling them Americans at this point, to convince the Americans that they would be better off without England. It's just common sense to know that. This is extremely effective. He is able to convert the majority of people who are undecided to his side, and they're like, yeah, we should want to be our own country. Once Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, comes out, there is a huge wave of Americans that now support independence. Once the founding fathers, your George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons and guys we'll start talking more about here, once these guys have the backing of the public, it is time to ramp up this fight for your independence from England and have the colonies be their own country. You're still the colonies are still a militia. They don't have anything. Like, there's no reason they should be able to, like, yeah, let's go fight them. You should still die. Like, there's no logical reason why the colonies should have any success at all against the British. There is a really big reason that in history, and especially in American history, they don't like to talk about because it doesn't make it seem as glorious about the fact that, spoiler alert, we're going to win. Once we come into open rebellion, meaning the colonies, a lot of other colonies around the world started being like, maybe we should do this. Once the American colonies go into open rebellion, it shows weakness on England's part. Like, how could England be this strong, super powerful country if your colonies are just going to openly rebel against you? Once England appears weak keep in mind, they're still the most powerful country on earth. Once they appear weak, their enemies, like France, declare war on England. All right? Once they, it's like sharks smelling blood in the water. Once England starts appearing weak, their enemies, the people who are closer to their strength, start declaring war on them. So throughout the entire Revolutionary War that we're going to start talking about today, and it doesn't last real long as far as history goes, a lot of cool, intricate stories, but it's pretty straightforward. Spoiler alert, the Americans are going to win. One of the reasons why that is, and it is the main reason, is England does not send their entire military over here to take the colonies back. They send a very small percentage of their military over here because they don't think the colonies are a legit threat. So you shouldn't have to send that many troops over, because where do you need your troops at if you're England? In England, defending England from the other European countries around them that now are starting to think about attacking them. So America, the colonies, are not fighting the entire British military, just the portion that the British bring over. Doesn't mean they're not extremely well trained and motivated. It just means they did not bring over the numbers that you would think on paper before this happened England would have provided. Very important to understand that. So Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. Once he writes Common Sense, I'll show you a picture. This is a picture of Thomas Paine here in Common Sense. Battles start picking up, all right? So this is still just open rebellion. The colonies there's no such thing as a Declaration of Independence. Haven't talked about any of that yet. They're just an open rebellion. There happens to be a huge, very important battle that's going to take place outside Boston at a place called Bunker Hill. What happens at Bunker Hill is the colonists and the redcoats are going to fight in a straight up battle. And the colonists are going to lose. And it's one of the biggest motivating factors in the entire war. Even though the colonists lost, the colonists feel like they won. You know why? They went straight up toe to toe, military to military, and they lost, but it wasn't awful. It could have gone either way. All of a sudden, the colonists, after Lexington Concord, and they fired a few shots and the redcoats ran away. Well, now you went to an actual legit battle against the most powerful military on earth, and you're like, huh. So while it was a loss, it would be like, you know, your high school basketball team playing a professional NBA team and expecting to get destroyed by 1,000 points, and you lose by 11. And you're like, huh, yeah, we lost, but well, daggone. The Battle of Bunker Hill is going to do that for the American mentality that, hey, even though we lost, we're legit. We can legit stand up to the British military. Once again, let me remind you, they do not have their entire military over here, and they never are going to send their entire military over here, not during the Revolutionary War. So Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, gets everybody on the side of we want our own independence. Battles begin. Well, once battles begin, there's no going back. So in the summer of 1776, so again, timeline here, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense in January of 1776. The Battle of Bunker Hill is going to take place in March of 1776. That summer, all the colonies get together, and they're going to write the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a document that says, hey, England, it's not you. It's us. We deserve better. It's a breakup letter to England. We're like, hey, it was fun while it lasted, but guess what? We're going to go be our own country. Things are just going to be different now. You didn't treat us right. All right? We tried. We did all we could. But all men are created equal, and you think we're inferior? That ain't going to fly over here. So we did everything we could. We had the First Continental Congress, and we tried to tell you our grievances. And then we had the Second Continental Congress, sent you the Olive Branch petition. You didn't want to hear any of that. So guess, we're done. It's not you. It's me. I deserve better. It is a straight up breakup letter to England in which we tell England, from this point forward, we're our own country. Now, how you think King George is going to respond to that? Not well. Not well at all. He refuses to acknowledge this, and a huge war is going to start. So the Declaration of Independence isn't like the end of a war and everybody acknowledges that we're in charge. What it is the beginning of the war, in which we say, nah, ain't gonna happen no more. So the war actually starts after the Declaration of Independence. It's not the end of anything, it's kind of the beginning. So this is what my students asked me about this for years, and I just didn't really think about looking it up one day, and it blew my mind. All right, so you'll like this. It's worth talking about. This picture right here is present day of the Declaration of Independence. It's in Washington, D.C., and oh my gosh, off the top of my head, I can't think of what building. Smithsonian? Maybe the Smithsonian. Library of Congress? Wow, this is really embarrassing. I can't think off the top of my head what building it is in. But this is in Washington, D.C. It is under like 6 inches of bulletproof glass, and like you can go in and see it. It's super temperature controlled. That is the actual Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, all right, who had taken ideas from John Locke, and eventually he'll use Rousseau and Montesquieu's ideas. But John Locke's idea that all men have the right to life, liberty, and property, according to John Locke, but Thomas Jefferson says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he writes this letter. It's a breakup letter. It's a big middle finger to England is what it is. It's like, nah, we're done with you. So present day, here's the document in the United States. So I've had students asking me before, hey, so when we wrote it and we sent it to King George, since he had torn up everything before, right? Considering he had torn up when we sent our grievances, he tore up the Olive Branch petition. What? He just kept the Declaration of Independence, the most disrespectful letter he's probably ever gotten, and he just kept it. And then at some point later on in history, the United States and England are on good enough terms, and we're like laughing, we're buddies, like, ha, ha, ha. And then America's like, hey, you remember that time we, more or less declared war on you and Declaration of Independence and all that? You think we can get that back? We'd like to put it on display to show our own people about how awesome we are. And England's like, oh, okay, here you go. You can have it back. So I was interested. I've had students ask me that, and I had no idea what the actual answer was. So I went and looked this up a few years ago, shamefully too far into teaching that I had never looked it up. Oh my gosh, the answer is, this is awesome. It shows the story at the time so much better. When we wrote the Declaration of Independence, we were done with England. We were so convinced that we were our own country, we didn't even send it to them. We wrote it here, and everybody signed it, high-fived it. Now, they made copies of it and sent it around the newspapers in the colonies to let everybody know we're our own country. We never sent one to England. We didn't care about them. Didn't matter if they liked it or not, or if they knew. Wasn't going to be a thing. Not only did we, it was a breakup letter, but we ghosted England. We just like unfriended them, right? Blocked them on social media, and then let everybody else know that we broke up with them. They'll figure out eventually. We'll have mutual friends. I'll let them know. When we wrote the Declaration of Independence, we was done with that relationship. So that is why we have it today, is we never gave it to them. We just wrote it for ourselves, acknowledged ourselves, pat ourselves on the back, and was like, that's some self-help that we needed. And then we're going to move on. So once King George finds out through the newspapers that America has declared independence, this is when he's going to send all the troops he is willing to send to the colonies. He does not think it's going to be a huge problem because the colonies don't even have a fully functioning military. George Washington is in charge of the Continental Army, but how good can that guy be? All right. Well, at the beginning of 1776, it does not go good at all. So these red dots here are the major battles. If you notice, most of the major battles are going to take place in the north. All right, because around Boston, where's Boston at? So Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, and then Boston would be up here. These were the initial ones, but then it's more here in the center near New York. New York City kind of becomes the heart of the Revolutionary War at different points. So the reason most of the fighting takes place here is because this is the urban centers. These are the cities. There were battles that we'll talk about, a couple here shortly, that take place further south. But for the most part, the South is so rural, right? Which means there's just plantations really spread out. You couldn't really do anything about sending an army over there. So once we declare our independence on July 4th, 1776 is when everybody signs it. And keep in mind, when they signed this document, if America loses this war, all those men who signed it will be executed for treason. All right, because of course you would. You just literally said, we're not your country anymore. And if you lose and you had to be their country, you would be executed. So they know the severity of signing their name. That's why John Hancock, so after they wrote it, they're like, all right, who's going to sign this? And John Hancock in the back, like everybody signed, like they're hesitant. And John Hancock, in the story that I'm familiar with, he's like, I'll do it. And he goes up and just writes his name like, wait, you got like 100 guys to sign it. And he takes up a third of the page writing his name. And he's like, I hope King George sees my name, like super big. And that's where John Hancock, the only time you'll really learn about him in U.S. history for this survey course, is where the term, I need your John Hancock. He's the most famous signature in American history because he writes it so big, knowing that by doing so, he could be signing his own death warrant if it doesn't go well. So when King George sends troops over here, it goes bad for the Americans real early on. So George Washington has his own Continental Army. So most of the Continental Army is going to do the fighting up here where you see these red dots. In the South, they have the militia. So they have militias in little towns that will join up with the Continental Army, but it just kind of depends on the town. In the South, the people in the South are vicious fighters, but they fight like the Indians did with guerrilla warfare. They'll come out, they'll stab somebody, and run back into the woods. They're not going to go toe-to-toe with the army the way George Washington does. The British are pretty legit. So he gets absolutely decimated at the beginning of this war. George Washington does. Boston kind of gets bum rushed. New York City gets bum rushed, and he has to give up. Like every place that George Washington is trying to secure, he loses. War is not going well in the first few months of this war. Famously, though, and this is extremely famous in American history, on Christmas of 1776, super famous picture here that is painted afterwards. George Washington, after being beat, decides to sneak across the Hudson River in the middle of the night and sneak attack some British soldiers. We'll go with that. To sneak attack some British soldiers here in New Jersey, and it is a massive victory for the colonists. This is huge. The fact that George Washington, who kept getting defeated, all of a sudden, in a daring move to come across this river in the middle of the night and sneak attack British troops and win, is a huge morale boost for the United States. Not called the United States at the time, but for the colonies. And it is the first big win of the war. So number 22, what is the Declaration of Independence and why is it important? We've talked about that here in detail. So make sure you get 2 sentences on this. Pause me, get 2 sentences, and then come on back. I'm very pausable. All right. So the next year, all right, America needs help. Specifically, all right, see all this blue stuff here on this map? It's called water. You know what controls water in wartime? The Navy. You know how big the colony's Navy is? Non-existent. We don't have a Navy. Why would we? We've been part of England. England has the most powerful Navy on earth. We've never needed a Navy until we claim we're our own country. Now, England has completely locked down the coastline and the oceans. This is really bad. Not only that, a lot of our big cities are ports. So in order to be able to trade or do anything, we have to have some freedom of the seas. We have to have a Navy to come and, to do anything against Britain at any point. Even just to be able to move our troops by the water, we need a Navy to secure troop movements. Well, we don't have a Navy. You know who we want help from? France. So France, and here's how countries work, and this is throughout U.S. history and world history as well. So France would love for England to lose this war. All right? Now, it's not like the French and Indian War where France believes that if England loses, they're going to gain the colonies. They know that's not a thing. If the colonies are in open rebellion against England, there would be an open rebellion against France if France took them over. So France still wants England to lose because if the colonies are independent and they're their own country, guess who's not getting a ton of money all the time? England. If England ain't getting a ton of money all the time, makes them a little weaker, maybe France can take over England. So France absolutely wants the colonists to win. The problem is, the last thing France wants to do is come over and help out the colonists, and then the colonists still lose. So the colonists are like, France, help us out. Please help us out. Help us out. Help us out. And France is like, I don't know, man. I don't know if y'all are good enough to help out. Like, I don't know if y'all can actually, if we came and helped you out, we'd have to almost be guaranteed that you could win. So what we want to see you to be able to win without us before we help you. This is always frustrating in history because the colonies are like, if we could win without you, we would win without you. Like, why would you ask that? So, but the colonies know they need a huge, impressive victory to impress the French to come help them out. They're going to get that in 1777 in a battle in Saratoga. It's in New York up here. All right. The Battle of Saratoga is considered the turning point of the war. Long story short, the British went toe-to-toe with George Washington's army. Every time before this, George Washington has lost. George Washington is going to win at the Battle of Saratoga and make the British army back down. Massive turning point in the war. Not only is France like, absolutely, we got your back, and France comes in and is going to join the side of the United States. I keep saying United States, the colonies. Join the side of the Americans, the side of the colonies. Not only will France come and join them, they're going to loan the colonies a ton of money. For the simplicity's sake, all right, for these numbers, because it was for future lessons, we're going to say the amount of money that France loaned the colonies is $13 million, which is a ton of money. So France loans the colonies $13 million to buy the stuff they need to, plus France is going to bring their navy over and help out the colonies in the oceans. So France doesn't really send soldiers. They'll send seamen over, the Navy guys on the Navy ships and money, but they don't send a lot of army soldiers because George Washington's like, I got this. So Battle of Saratoga is a huge turning point because after we win that one battle, France comes and helps out the colonists, which we desperately needed. So then, and this is, I don't know if you've ever heard of George Washington, jumping around a little bit here. He's pretty famous, all right? You probably know George Washington from the time that you ever went to school. He was the first president of the United States. I have at the time of this recording, I have a kindergartner and a second grader. They both know about George Washington. They teach it in elementary school. He's the first president of the United States, and rightfully so. George Washington, pretty awesome first leader of the United States. Not a perfect person, all right? He was a slave owner, but as far as a leader, America at the time, there really wouldn't have been somebody better than George Washington, if for no other purpose than the entire country of free people, right? Not slaves, obviously, because they couldn't vote. The entire country loved George Washington. So how did George Washington get loved? Well, it's stories like I'm getting ready to tell you here that build up his legend. And legends usually mean they're exaggerated and not true, or they're too extra. This, I guess, wouldn't be a legend. This is a true story of what happened, and it's pretty impressive to show him as a person. So the winter between 1777 and 1788 is brutal cold. Super cold. It's one of the coldest on record of all times. So the winter is so cold, we're like in a mini ice age at the time. George Washington has to go hunker down for the winter. All right. So the Battle of Saratoga is over, hunkering down for the winter. Crazy cold. And he's going to hunker down at a place called Valley Forge. It's a mini ice age back then, which means it got crazy cold in the United States, much colder than it is now. And plus, keep in mind, this is much further north than we are in North Carolina. So it is super, super cold. His job is to keep these men alive. So the springtime, he can go out and fight. He has no food. All these men were farmers. He has not paid them. They have no food. Not only that, smallpox is starting to just run rampant through his men's camp. They have no supplies. These men who have marched thousands of miles. I mean, you have to walk everywhere you go around the whole country. All their shoes are worn out and they don't have shoes. So George Washington is expected to sit down in this camp all winter in one of the coldest winters on record, while people are getting killed with smallpox, while their feet are freezing off, while they have volunteered for this army. All right, they are not getting paid, and they could at any point pack up and go home. They got a nice warm fire sitting back home, probably wife, kids sitting back home waiting for him. All right, his job is to keep them here while disease is spreading rampant through the camps. Jumping ahead, because I like how to tell a story, and everybody expects, Britain completely expects the war is over because George Washington is not going to have an army in the spring. Anybody who didn't die over the winter will have deserted in the middle of the winter because it's just crazy. Who would sit there and starve to death with diseases and no shoes and all this other stuff? Who would do that? George Washington rolls out the next spring with his entire army ready to go. And it blows everybody's mind. There's no internet. There's no daily updates on what's happening here at Valley Forge. They just had to wait. They didn't know if anybody was going to come out. And his whole army comes out ready to go. During that winter, he'd found a way to provide provisions. He'd found a way to get the things that they needed. The smallpox, he was able to start using inoculations, almost like a vaccine, to stop its spread and make the people immune to it before they even got it. Not only that, but the men believed in him so much, probably in large part after his big victory of Saratoga, that he is able to rally them, and they believe in him enough that the next spring he rolls out ready to fight. This blows the mind of the British, and it adds to the lore of George Washington. George Washington, if nothing else, is a great leader. The men will follow him. And his success at Valley Forge, of keeping his army together in Valley Forge, is the prime example of his effective and efficient and good leadership among people. So the question here is, why was the Battle of Saratoga considered the turning point for the American Revolutionary War? Well, who got involved? So tell me about what happened at Saratoga, real simply from what we've talked about here, and how that's a turning point. Talked about that in detail. So pause me if you need to and answer those, and we're going to move on. So the next year in 1778, Washington rolls out of the Valley Forge, and when he shows back up and everybody's like, heck yeah, France, who had already agreed to help us out, now actually starts sending in ships and stuff in the spring to following next year as the war starts up again. Absolutely fantastic in 1778. Now all of a sudden the colonies, instead of being like, oh, we're gonna fight this little skirmish, it's we're in it for the long haul. Like, that's the mentality. In 1778, after Valley Forge, kept his army together, comes out, everybody's hunkered down for as long as this is going to take. Nobody's going to quit and be like, I don't want to fight anymore. The colonists are committed. They believe in their leader, who is George Washington, who's the head general, and he's going to bring them success. And that is the belief in the colonies at the time. So this is just a picture of America and France, like we team up here. Again, France, not only the Navy is it great, but it's also the money. $13 million is what they give us. That's not the exact number if you go and Google it, but there's a reason I use the term 13 million, because it makes some math we're going to do here in the next couple lessons a lot more simpler if I use 13 million. So 13 million is what France loans us, which is a ton of money. Lets us buy the supplies, shoes, stuff like that we need for our troops. So the question here is, what was so great about France coming to help us out? What does France gain by helping the Americans out? All right. Remember, France isn't expecting to help us out and take us over. How does this benefit France to help us out? We talked about this earlier in the lesson. So make sure you get 2 complete sentences there. And again, pause me or go back if you need to. All right. So from like 1778 to 1781, it's vicious fighting. In the South, when the Redcoats venture down south, they hate it. The Redcoats do, because the soldiers in the South don't fight like a normal army. They come running out with hatchets and junk, and they fight like the Indians fight. This idea of guerrilla warfare. And so Charlotte, in North Carolina, between North and South Carolina, Charlotte has a basketball team called the Charlotte Hornets. The reason that is labeled that is because Cornwallis did not want to go anywhere near Charlotte because everybody would just run out and attack you. He said Charlotte was like a hornet's nest. So because of that, him saying it was like a hornet's nest, everybody just avoided it like the plague. Didn't want to have anything to do with it. So that's where the term Charlotte Hornets comes from, is Cornwallis saying it was like going towards a hornet's nest in the Revolutionary War. Pudding Ridge in Davie County, North Carolina, where there's a golf course, they have a sign out there. Cornwallis marched through the area and said it was so muddy it was like walking through pudding. And that's where the term Pudding Ridge comes from, is actually Cornwallis in the Revolutionary War in Davie County gave it its name. So one of the things that's going to happen in 1777, jumping back a little bit, once we declare our independence from England, well, who's in charge? England's not in charge. We've rejected them. So the Americans have to rush out real quick and create our own, we'll call it a constitution, our own way of running our government. All right. What don't we want? England. So we do the complete opposite of what England does with our government, and we create this thing called the Articles of Confederation. So our government is going to be the opposite of England. What don't we want? We do not want a king. Don't want one. So not only does the Articles of Confederation, the very first government that the colonies are going to have, that the first American government, all right, not only does the colonies not have a king, they have no central government. There is nobody that makes the final decision at the top, because that's bad. On top of that, you know what else the colonies didn't want? Unfair taxing. All right. So you know what the colonies did about taxing under the Articles of Confederation? There was no way to tax people on the federal level. So absolutely insane when you look at it, of how opposite the Articles of Confederation were from what they were with the British. And we're going to talk about that in future lessons in great detail. So the Articles of Confederation get put in place because you had to have a system of government. Because once you reject England, you're not still going to go with their rules. So the Articles of Confederation get put in place. And the reason people love them, spoiler alert, the Articles of Confederation are garbage because it doesn't do anything. There's no control over anything. But people initially really wanted the Articles of Confederation because it's the complete opposite of Britain. It gives you as much freedom as possible. However, you still need a government to be able to do stuff. But the Articles of Confederation gave all the power to the states, which is what the colonies start calling themselves, states. Articles of Confederation will give all the power to the states. And they're like, we'll just work together. We don't need a federal government. We don't need somebody actually telling all of us what to do collectively. We'll figure it out. So not the greatest government. And we'll talk about it in detail in future lessons. But that comes out in 1777 during the Revolutionary War. Because again, 1776, you're out of here. The next year, they hastily throw together this government, which is more based on what they don't want than what they do want. So by 1781, again, Britain's still fighting around the world other people. The French are able to force the British into the Chesapeake Bay, all right, and leaves the British forces at Yorktown vulnerable. So here's what happens. There's a little peninsula. And all the Cornwallis, who is the head, I keep saying Cornwallis, haven't said who he is. Cornwallis is the head general for England during the Revolutionary War. Sorry, should have clarified that earlier. Cornwallis gets pushed down his little peninsula in Virginia. All the water around it gets surrounded with the French ships, so he can't go anywhere. And then George Washington comes down the peninsula and forces him to surrender. All right. So in 1781, the Battle of Yorktown is where this happens at. General Cornwallis, who's the head of the British military, officially surrenders to the United States to George Washington, and the Revolutionary War is going to be over. The treaty that's going to officially end the war is called the Treaty of Paris, in which England acknowledges that the colonies are their own country now. And it is a resounding success. And these little peons, these revolutionary little colonies with a militia, just stood up to the most powerful country in the world, and basically had them cry uncle. And the colonies stood up to England, declared their independence, and now they're going to be their own official country after Yorktown. So the Americans have won the war, and from this point on, they are called the Americans. This is just talking, I just put this picture in here for a visual, that they're drafted the Articles of Confederation, our first government. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about that in detail. And then the final battle of the war is down here in Yorktown, in which Cornwallis has to surrender to George Washington. And this is a picture of George Washington back here. And I guess this is supposed to be Cornwallis surrendering to him. And it is a huge, huge change in world events. People can't believe that these colonies have stood up to the most powerful country on earth. Keep in mind, England owns colonies around the world. There's going to start to be some pushback now from these other colonies after they see America stands up to them and wins. Why did we win? England only sent a small portion of their military over here, and that's who we had to defeat, not the entire military. That's important because in future units, America tends to forget that. As soon as we beat them, we're like, get some, England! And we're pretty overconfident about it. So the question here is, why do the colonists create a new government before England surrenders? Like, why was it necessary to have a government in place before England leaves and goes home? We have talked about that with the Articles of Confederation. So just in 2 sentences, explain why we needed a government during the Revolutionary War before England surrendered. All right, that's as far as we're going to get to today. I will see you guys tomorrow.